The sound was a frantic, fluttering rhythm, like a hummingbird trapped in a jar. It was the most beautiful sound Edith Merritt had ever heard. There it is, 160 beats per minute, a strong, healthy heartbeat, Dr. Chen said, smiling as she guided the ultrasound wand over Edith's still flat stomach. Tears pricked Edith's eyes. This tiny, fluttering life was real. It was hers and Robert's. She couldn't wait to surprise him, to see the impenetrable facade of Robert Monaghan, the real estate titan, crack into the joyful grin of a father-to-be. She clutched the grainy thermal paper printout like a winning lottery ticket, unaware that in less than an hour it would feel like an obituary for the life she thought she had. The lobby of Monaghan Properties was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings of glass and steel, floors of polished black granite that reflected your insignificance back at you, and a quiet, reverent hush that spoke of serious money being moved. For 5 years, it had felt like a second home to Edith. Today, it felt like a foreign country. The receptionist, a young woman named Chloe, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, gave Edith a practiced, welcoming look. "Mrs. Monaghan, what a lovely surprise. Mr. Monaghan isn't expecting you." "I know," Edith beamed, holding her purse a little tighter. The precious ultrasound photo was tucked safely inside. "I have the best kind of surprise for him." "Is he in his office?" Chloe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something. Panic crossed her face before the corporate mask snapped back into place. "He is, but he's in a very important meeting with Ms. Todd from Acquisitions. He left strict instructions not to be disturbed. Tonya Todd." The name was familiar. Young, sharp, aggressive. Robert had mentioned her a few times, impressed by her killer instinct. Edith's joy was a buoyant bubble that couldn't be popped by a simple meeting. "Oh, it'll just take a second. This is bigger than any acquisition, I promise." She started towards the private elevator that led to the executive suites on the 50th floor. Chloe practically sprang from her chair. "Mrs. Monaghan, please, I really can't let you go up." He was very specific. The unusual urgency in the young woman's voice finally registered. A tiny, cold prickle of unease started in Edith's gut. For 5 years, she'd had unfettered access. She was the wife, the future mother of his heir, the woman Robert called his North Star. Why was she being blocked like a common sales rep? "Chloe, it's fine," Edith said, her voice a little cooler now. "I'm his wife. I'll take full responsibility." She pressed the elevator button. Her reflection, a soft, elegant woman in a cream-colored cashmere dress, a stark contrast to the hard angles of the lobby. The elevator ride was silent, a smooth, swift ascent that normally felt like a thrill. Today, with every floor they passed, the cold prickle in her stomach grew into a knot of dread. Why had Chloe been so desperate to stop her? The 50th floor landing was silent. Robert's personal assistant, a stern, older woman who had been with him for decades, wasn't at her desk. Strange. The double doors to his corner office were slightly ajar. Edith could hear faint sounds from within. Not the booming cadence of Robert's negotiating voice, but a low murmur and a soft, feminine laugh. Her heart began to beat a frantic rhythm of its own, a sick counterpoint to the healthy flutter of her babies. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The office was a masterpiece of corporate power. A wall of floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan. A massive mahogany desk stood empty. Her eyes were drawn to the plush leather sofa in the corner, and there they were. Robert Monaghan, her husband of 5 years, the man who held her hand through 2 miscarriages and promised her the world, was not in a meeting. He was leaning over Tonya Todd, his hand tangled in her sleek, dark hair. Her blouse was unbuttoned, his tie was loosened, and they were locked in a passionate, ravenous kiss. It wasn't a clumsy, drunken mistake. It was practiced, intimate. The air was thick with a familiarity that spoke of countless stolen moments. Time seemed to warp, slowing down until each second was a distinct, painful frame. The soft wool of her dress, the cold leather of her purse strap digging into her shoulder, the crinkle of the ultrasound photo inside, the sound of her own breathing, loud and ragged in the silent office. They didn't see her at first. Edith made a small, involuntary sound, a gasp, a sob, she wasn't sure. Robert's head snapped up. His eyes, usually a cool, calculating blue, widened in shock, but it was immediately replaced by something else. Annoyance. Pure, unadulterated irritation at being interrupted. There was no shame, no panic, no guilt, just the cold fury of a king whose private chambers had been breached. Tonya Todd pulled away, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she coolly buttoned her blouse. She looked at Edith not as a woman wronged, but as a competitor who had just been rendered obsolete. "Edith," Robert said, his voice a low growl. He stood up, straightening his tie, a gesture of composure that was more insulting than any apology. "You should have called." The sheer audacity of it, the blame in his tone, broke the spell. The world came rushing back in a torrent of nausea and white-hot pain. Edith didn't scream. She didn't cry. She did the only thing she could. She turned and walked away. She walked past the empty assistant's desk, into the silent elevator, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. As the doors slid shut, sealing her in the mirrored box, she finally saw her own reflection. The joyful, expectant mother was gone. In her place was a ghost, her face a pale mask of horror, and in her hand she was still clutching the purse containing the grainy, black and white image of a promise that had just been shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces. The elevator descended, but Edith felt like she was in free fall. The smooth, silent drop mirrored the plummeting of her stomach, the collapse of her entire world. When the doors opened to the cavernous lobby, she walked straight through, her gaze fixed on the revolving glass doors ahead. She didn't see Chloe's stricken face or hear the hushed whispers that followed in her wake. The city noise hit her like a physical blow, the blare of horns, the distant wail of a siren, the cacophony of a million lives moving forward while hers had just ground to a sickening halt. She didn't take a cab. She didn't call her driver. She just walked. Her feet, clad in expensive but impractical heels, moved automatically over the cracked Manhattan pavement. She walked without direction, a ghost drifting through the bustling crowds. Fifth Avenue, with its glittering storefronts that once promised a life of effortless luxury, now seemed grotesque. The diamonds in the Tiffany's window looked like shards of ice. The mannequins in Bergdorf's, draped in silks and furs, were just hollow effigies of a life she was no longer part of. Her phone began to buzz in her purse, a persistent, angry vibration. She knew it was Robert. She ignored it. It buzzed again, and again. A text message notification popped up on her watch. "Edith, where are you? We need to talk about this. Talk about this." As if it were a business negotiation that had gone awry. As if his betrayal could be itemized, discussed, and resolved with a revised set of terms. The clinical, detached language sent a fresh wave of revulsion through her. She found herself in Central Park, the manicured paths and autumn-tinged trees a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She sank onto a cold, empty bench, the buzzing in her purse finally stopping. The silence that followed was somehow louder. She pulled out the ultrasound photo, the tiny, bean-shaped flicker of life. Her baby. Their baby. The word "their" was a knife in her heart. This child was conceived in a bed that was a lie. It would be born into a home built on deceit. What kind of life would this be, raised by a father who saw commitment as a minor inconvenience, and a mother whose heart had just been pulverized? The psychological torment began its insidious work. The whispers of self-doubt she had suppressed for years grew into a roar. Was she not interesting enough? Not ambitious enough? She had willingly stepped back from her own promising career as an art curator to be the perfect corporate wife, hosting flawless dinner parties, managing their homes, being the serene, elegant woman on his arm. She had thought it was a partnership. Now she saw it for what it was, a role. And apparently she was replaceable. Tonya Todd was younger, hungrier, a player in his world. Edith was just the wife. Another text from Robert. Don't be so dramatic, Edie. This isn't what it looked like. The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting, it almost made her laugh. A hysterical, broken sound caught in her throat. Not what it looked like? It was exactly what it looked like. It was the oldest, most cliché story in the book. The powerful man and his young subordinate. The trusting wife at home. A cold, hard clarity began to cut through the fog of her pain. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. The late nights he'd called board meetings. The weekend trips for investor relations. The sudden, inexplicable distance that had grown between them over the past year, which she had foolishly attributed to the stress of his work. It all snapped into focus, each lie a perfectly placed piece in a mosaic of betrayal. She thought about their sprawling penthouse overlooking the park. It wasn't a home, it was a stage. Every piece of art, every piece of furniture had been chosen to project an image of power and success. His success. Her life had become an accessory to his. And now, the accessory was tarnished. The decision crystallized not in a moment of anger, but in a moment of chilling calm. She could not go back. She could not sit across from him at their polished dining table and pretend this hadn't happened. She could not raise her child in that house, in that life, breathing the poisoned air of his lies. To stay would be to slowly suffocate, to let a piece of her soul die every day. Her baby deserved more. She deserved more. The buzzing started again. This time she answered. "Where the hell are you, Edith?" Robert's voice was tight with controlled rage. Not concern. Rage. The rage of a man who had lost control of the narrative. Edith looked up at the indifferent sky. Her own voice, when it came, was unrecognizable. It was quiet, steady, and hollowed out. "I'm leaving you, Robert." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Don't be ridiculous, you're upset. Come home and we'll sort this out." "There is nothing to sort out," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "I saw you. I saw the truth. It's over. You're pregnant with my child, Edith. You're not going anywhere." The possessiveness in his tone, the way he said, "my child," sealed it. "You're wrong," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She ended the call, blocking his number without a second thought. She stood up from the bench, her movements stiff. The long walk wasn't over. She wasn't walking home. She was walking away from it. She had no plan, no money of her own to speak of. Everything was tied up in his name, in their joint accounts. She was pregnant, alone, and adrift in a city of 8 million people. But for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't borrowed from Robert's success. It was a terrifying, fragile thing. It was her own agency. She took out her phone one last time and scrolled through her contacts, past the society friends and business acquaintances, until she found a name she hadn't called in years. A lifeline to a life before Robert. Her finger hovered over the screen, then pressed down. "Keith," she said, her voice finally breaking. "It's Edith. Edith Merritt. I need your help." Keith Witherspoon's law office was the antithesis of Robert's world. Located in a pre-war building in Brooklyn, it was a space of controlled chaos. Bookshelves overflowed with legal texts. Stacks of case files covered most flat surfaces, and the air smelled of old paper and strong coffee. Keith himself hadn't changed since their college days, still lanky, with a thoughtful brow and kind eyes that had a knack for seeing right through people's defenses. He specialized in pro bono work, fighting for tenants against slum lords, and representing clients who couldn't afford the kind of slick, corporate lawyers Robert kept on retainer. He took one look at Edith's pale, shattered face and simply said, "Come in. Sit down. I'll make coffee." "Decaf," she said numbly, sinking into a worn leather armchair. I'm pregnant." Keith paused, his hand on the coffee pot. His expression softened from concern to a deep, aching sympathy. "Oh, Edie, I'm so sorry." He didn't need to ask what was wrong. The fact that she was here, looking like a refugee from a gilded cage, told him everything. For the next hour, the story poured out of her. The ultrasound, the office, Tonya Todd's smug expression, Robert's infuriating lack of remorse. Keith listened patiently, his hands steepled, his gaze never wavering. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He just let her empty the poison from her system. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper, he finally spoke. "Okay," he said, his tone calm and methodical. "Here's what he's going to do. First, he'll try to control you. He's already started with the calls and texts. When that doesn't work, he'll try to buy you, offering a generous settlement with a rock-solid NDA. When you refuse that, he'll threaten you. He'll use the baby as leverage. He'll say you're an unfit mother, that you're emotionally unstable. He'll hire the most ruthless custody lawyers in the state. He'll try to bleed you dry, emotionally and financially, until you come crawling back on his terms." Hearing it laid out so clinically was terrifying, but also validating. It was exactly what Robert would do. He didn't see a family. He saw an asset, a negotiation. "I can't fight him, Keith," Edith whispered, despair creeping back in. "He has everything. I have nothing. My name is on the bank accounts, but he controls them. My car is leased by his company. The penthouse is in his name. I'm a glorified dependent." "No, you're not," Keith said firmly. "You're his wife, and you're the mother of his child. That gives you rights. But you're right about one thing. A head-on fight right now would be brutal. He'd bury us in legal motions before we even got to discovery." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "So we don't fight him. Not yet. We make you disappear." The idea was both terrifying and liberating. To simply vanish. How? You have one asset he can't easily touch, right? The inheritance your grandmother left you. The trust fund. Edith had forgotten about it. It wasn't a huge amount by Monaghan standards. A little over $100,000 from her grandmother. A fiercely independent woman who had insisted the trust be set up solely in Edith's maiden name, Merritt, as walking away money, just in case. At the time, Edith had laughed. Now, it felt like a lifeline from beyond the grave. "We'll have to be smart about it," Keith continued, already sketching notes on a legal pad. "We liquidate it quietly. No big transfers. We'll move it through a series of accounts. I'll help you establish a new identity. Nothing illegal, just a new life under your maiden name. New bank account, new phone, new address. You'll become Edith Merritt again." The name felt foreign, a relic from a past life. But saying it, even in her mind, felt like taking a breath of fresh air. Meanwhile, from the 50th floor of his glass tower, Robert Monaghan was discovering the limits of his power. His calls went to voicemail. His texts were undelivered. He went to their penthouse, expecting to find her crying in their bedroom, ready for his carefully crafted speech of apology and explanation. He found the apartment empty. Her closet was untouched, her jewelry box full. But her passport was gone, along with a small, sentimental box of her mother's things. His initial annoyance curdled into a cold fury. This wasn't part of the script. Edith was supposed to be emotional, malleable. This silent, decisive action was something new. It was defiance. And Robert Monaghan didn't tolerate defiance. He did exactly what Keith predicted. He called his head of security, a former NYPD detective with a network of contacts. "Find my wife," he commanded. "She's pregnant and emotionally distraught. I'm worried about her." He framed it as concern, but it was a directive for retrieval. He wanted his property back. For the next 48 hours, Keith and Edith moved quickly. While Robert's men were checking airports and credit card statements tied to Edith Monaghan, Keith was setting up a new life for Edith Merritt. They found a small cottage for rent in a quiet, forgotten town in the Berkshires of western Massachusetts, a place of rolling hills, sleepy main streets, and spotty cell service. It was the last place anyone would look for the wife of a Manhattan millionaire. On the third day, Edith walked out of Keith's office with a prepaid burner phone, a debit card for a new bank account funded with her grandmother's money, and a map. She wore jeans, a simple sweater, and a baseball cap, a uniform of anonymity. She looked nothing like the woman in the cashmere dress. "Are you sure about this, Edie?" Keith asked, his eyes filled with worry. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm more terrified of staying. He won't be looking for Edith Merritt. He's looking for Mrs. Monaghan, and she doesn't exist anymore." She took a bus from Port Authority, the grimy, bustling station a world away from the private cars and pristine lobbies she was used to. As the bus pulled out of the Lincoln Tunnel and into the fading light of a New Jersey evening, she looked back at the Manhattan skyline, a glittering cage she had just escaped. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of farewell. She was driving into the unknown, a pregnant woman with a broken heart and a small bank account. But she was driving towards a life that would be, for the first time in a long time, entirely her own. The town of Northwood, Massachusetts, was a place where time seemed to slow down. It was a town of white-steepled churches, a single blinking traffic light on Main Street, and a sprawling town green where farmers' markets were held on Saturdays. For Edith, now living as Edith Merritt in a small clapboard cottage on a dirt road, it was a sanctuary. The silence was the first thing she noticed. It was a living entity, broken only by the chirping of crickets at night and the rustle of wind through the ancient maple trees. After years of the constant hum of Manhattan, the quiet was both unnerving and deeply healing. The first few months were a blur of survival. She bought a used, reliable station wagon, furnished her cottage with second-hand furniture from the town's antique co-op, and learned the art of living on a budget. The luxuries she'd taken for granted, gourmet groceries, designer clothes, weekly spa treatments, evaporated. They were replaced by simpler, more profound pleasures. The taste of a fresh tomato from the farm stand, the warmth of a quilt she'd bought at a church sale, the joy of feeling her baby kick for the first time without a shadow of betrayal looming over the moment. Her pregnancy progressed, her belly swelling into a gentle, protective curve. She found a local doctor, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, who asked no questions about her past or the absence of a father. In Northwood, people respected privacy. You were judged not by who you were, but by what you did. And Edith, or Edie as her neighbours came to know her, was quiet, polite, and kept to herself. She began to paint again. She'd given up her art after marrying Robert, convinced by his subtle dismissals that it was a cute hobby, but not a serious pursuit. Now, with a set of cheap acrylics and canvases from the local craft store, she rediscovered her voice. She didn't paint the grand cityscapes she used to. She painted the gnarled bark of an oak tree, the way the morning light filtered through her kitchen window, the quiet strength in the faces of the women at the local diner. Her art became her therapy, a way to process the trauma and reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. But the ghost of her past life was never far away. Some nights she would wake up in a cold sweat. The image of Robert and Tonya on that leather sofa burned into her mind. The psychological conflict raged within her. She was building a new life, finding a strength she never knew she possessed. Yet she was also a fugitive. Every time a new car drove slowly down her road, her heart would seize with panic. Every unfamiliar number that called her burner phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Keith was her only link to that world. They spoke once a week, their conversations a carefully choreographed dance of coded language. He updated her on Robert's search. It was relentless. Robert had hired a top-tier private investigation firm. They had flagged her dental records, put alerts on her social security number, and interviewed every friend and acquaintance she had. "He's furious, Edie," Keith told her one evening, his voice grim. "It's not about love or reconciliation anymore. It's about his ego. You defied him. You disappeared with what he considers his legacy. He's treating this like a hostile takeover, and he's determined to win." The knowledge was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. She was living on borrowed time. The first near miss happened in her 7th month. She had driven to Pittsfield, the nearest large town, to buy a crib. As she was leaving the baby store, she saw him, a man in a dark suit, leaning against a car, looking out of place among the local shoppers. He wasn't looking at her, but his eyes were scanning the crowd with a professional, searching intensity. It was the same look Robert's security detail always had. Edith's blood ran cold. She ducked her head, pulling her coat tighter, and walked quickly in the opposite direction, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't look back. She got in her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit the key in the ignition, and drove home, taking a winding, indirect route. That night, she couldn't sleep. The cottage, which had been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The quiet of the woods was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, filled with unseen watchers. She was a lone woman, heavily pregnant, miles from anyone who could help her. The power imbalance she had fled felt more acute than ever. He was out there, a vast, powerful entity with limitless resources, and she was just one woman hiding in the woods. She looked at her growing collection of paintings leaning against the wall. They were honest and raw, and full of a quiet beauty she had found in her solitude. They were proof of the woman she was becoming. She thought of the baby, safe and warm inside her, a life untainted by the Monaghan name and its suffocating legacy. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, something else was hardening. Resolve. She was done being a victim. She was done hiding. Robert might see this as a battle for his legacy, but for Edith, it was a fight for her child's future and her own soul. The quiet season was over. A storm was coming, and for the first time she felt ready to face it. The day Robert found her, the sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Winter had settled over the Berkshires, dusting the pines with a thin layer of snow and turning the air crisp and clean. Edith, 9 months pregnant and feeling as large and slow as a barge, was on her porch, sketching the stark beauty of the winter landscape. A black, obscenely expensive-looking sedan crunched up her gravel driveway. It was so out of place in her rustic world that for a moment she felt only confusion. Then the passenger door opened and Robert Monaghan stepped out. He looked thinner, his face harder, the lines around his mouth etched deeper. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, his city shoes looking ridiculous on the snowy ground. He surveyed her small cottage, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust, as if he couldn't comprehend how she could choose this provincial squalor, over the life he had given her. Edith's first instinct was to run, to bolt the door, hide, and pray he would go away. But her body was heavy, and her spirit, forged in months of solitude and self-reliance, refused to cower. She remained seated in her rocking chair, her sketchbook held loosely in her lap, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. She had fantasized about this moment, played out 1,000 different scenarios in her mind. Now that it was here, a strange, chilling calm settled over her. This was not his boardroom. This was not his office. This was her home. "Edith," he said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of acquisition. He had found his missing property. "Robert," she replied, her voice even. "You're trespassing." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He was expecting tears, recriminations, a dramatic scene. He was not prepared for this quiet, unshakable composure. "I've been looking for you for 6 months," he said, taking a step closer. "I was worried sick." The lie was so bald-faced, so insulting, it didn't even sting. "No, you weren't," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You were angry that you lost control. Don't pretend this is about anything else." He stopped, his corporate charm offensive hitting a brick wall. He changed tactics. "This is insane, Edie. Living out here in this. Look at you. This isn't the life for you or for my child." "That's where you're wrong," she said, finally standing up, a slow, deliberate movement. The full swell of her pregnancy was now impossible for him to ignore. She was no longer just the wife who had left. She was the mother of a child about to be born. "This is the first real life I've had in years, and this is my child, Robert. You forfeited your right to any claim on that title on a leather sofa with Tonya Todd." His face tightened. He took another step, his voice dropping to the low, menacing tone he used to close deals. "Let's stop the games. I'm prepared to be generous. We can put this all behind us. I'll fire Tonya. We can go back to how things were. You'll come back to New York, have the baby at the best hospital with the best doctors. I'll buy you anything you want. A new apartment, a house in the Hamptons, just name it." It was his ultimate move, the transaction. Everything and everyone had a price. He was trying to buy back his family, to erase his infidelity with a checkbook, and in that moment, Edith finally understood his hidden motive. It wasn't about love, or even reconciliation. It was about the baby. This child wasn't a son or daughter to him. It was an heir, an extension of his ego, a continuation of the Monaghan dynasty he was so obsessed with building. She and the baby were his legacy, and their absence was a stain on his perfect public image. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, a sad, pitying smile on her lips. "There is no price. You can't buy this. You can't buy me. And you will never, ever control my child." His mask of civility finally cracked, revealing the raw, narcissistic rage beneath. "You think you can keep my son from me?" he snarled. "It's a girl," Edith said calmly. The words hung in the cold air, a simple fact that seemed to completely derail him. A girl. Not the Monaghan son and heir he had already envisioned. "I will take you to court," he hissed. "I will prove you're unstable. I'll tell them how you ran away, how you're living in poverty. I will strip you of everything. You will have nothing." This was the man she had married. Not the charming philanthropist who charmed boardrooms, but this cold, cruel stranger who would destroy the mother of his child to win. The fear she had lived with for months was gone, burned away by a fierce, primal fire. This was the mother bear, cornered and ready to fight for her cub. "Try it," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am not the same woman who walked out of your office, Robert. I am not your possession. And this baby," she said, her hand on her stomach, "is not a Monaghan asset. She is my daughter, and I will protect her from you, no matter what it costs." The power dynamic had irrevocably flipped. He had all the money, all the lawyers, all the influence. But she had something he wanted and could never, ever force. Her and her child. She held all the real power, and they both knew it. Defeated for now, Robert stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had come here expecting to find a broken, desperate woman he could easily manipulate. He had found a queen in her own right, ruling over a tiny, humble kingdom he could never conquer. Without another word, he turned, got back in his black sedan, and drove away, leaving tracks in the snow and a cloud of exhaust in the clean mountain air. Edith stood on the porch, watching until he was gone, her hand never leaving her belly. She had won the battle, but she knew the war was just beginning. Robert's departure did not bring peace. It brought the cold, calculated fury of a thwarted king. Within a week, the first legal papers arrived, delivered by a bewildered local courier. It was a petition for emergency custody, a document filled with vicious, fabricated claims. It painted Edith as an emotionally volatile and mentally unstable woman who had recklessly endangered her unborn child by fleeing and living in unsuitable conditions. Robert's legal team, the best and most ruthless money could buy, had officially declared war. Edith, however, was ready. The moment Robert's car had disappeared down her road, she had called Keith. "He found me," she'd said, her voice steady. "The war is here." Keith, true to his word, had been preparing. He had already connected Edith with a sharp, formidable family law attorney in Massachusetts, a woman named Maria Sanchez, who had a reputation for fighting for the underdog. Together, they launched a counter-offensive. Before Robert could serve his papers, they filed for divorce in Massachusetts court, citing adultery. They attached a sworn affidavit from Edith, detailing the events in his office, along with a request for a restraining order. They were not just defending, they were attacking. The next few weeks were a blur of legal maneuvers, frantic phone calls, and mounting anxiety. Robert's lawyers tried to move the case to New York, where his influence was greater. Maria fought them at every turn, arguing that Edith was a legal resident of Massachusetts. The stress was immense, and Edith felt the weight of it every day. Her due date was approaching, and the prospect of giving birth while embroiled in a brutal legal battle was terrifying. Her redemption was not a single, dramatic moment, but a slow, daily grind. It was choosing to eat a healthy meal for the baby when all she wanted to do was curl up in despair. It was taking her prenatal vitamins, going for walks in the cold air, and forcing herself to paint, even when her hands shook. Her redemption was in her quiet, relentless refusal to be broken. The women of Northwood, who had once been polite strangers, became her silent support system. They would leave casseroles on her porch, offer to drive her to appointments, and give her nods of encouragement at the post office, sensing a struggle without needing to know the details. 1 week before her due date, a sharp, intense pain shot through her back. The baby was coming. In a panic, she called her neighbor, an older woman named Carol, who drove her to the small community hospital in Pittsfield. The labor was long and difficult, a physical manifestation of the emotional battle she had been waging. Through the waves of pain, she focused on a single point: the face of the child she was fighting for. After 14 hours, at 3:17 in the morning, her daughter was born. She was small, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. As the nurse placed the warm, wailing bundle on her chest, Edith felt a wave of love so powerful, so absolute, it washed away all the fear and pain. She had done it. She had brought this perfect, innocent life into the world, safe and sound. She named her Grace. 2 days later, back in her cottage, Keith called. His voice was different. "He's dropping the custody suit, Edie." Edith was stunned. "What? Why? It doesn't make sense. He was playing to win." "His father got involved," Keith explained. The old man. Apparently, he read the details in our filing. The stuff about Tonya Todd, the blatant adultery. He's old school. He doesn't mind his son being a shark in business. But this kind of public, messy scandal, dragging a pregnant wife through the mud, it was a bridge too far. He sees it as a stain on the Monaghan name. He ordered Robert to stand down. It was an anticlimactic, almost absurd end to the war. Not a victory in court, not a change of heart, but a business decision made by the family patriarch to protect the brand. A week later, a final package arrived from Robert's new lawyers. It was a divorce settlement. It was cold, transactional, and brutally simple. He relinquished all parental rights to Grace. In exchange for his name being kept off the birth certificate and a permanent non-disclosure agreement from Edith, a trust fund would be established for the child's education and welfare. He would provide financial support from a distance, but he wanted no part in her life. There was no letter, no apology, no final word. For Robert, the battle was lost, the asset written off. His redemption, if it could be called that, was not in finding his humanity, but in cutting his losses. He chose his name, his legacy, his empire over his own daughter. Edith sat at her simple kitchen table, the legal documents spread out before her, and signed her name, Edith Merritt. She looked over at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, and felt not sadness, but a profound sense of relief. Grace would grow up without a powerful, wealthy father, but she would also grow up free from his corrosive influence, his conditional love, and the weight of his name. She would grow up in a small cottage, surrounded by the quiet of the woods and the love of a mother who had fought a dragon for her. And that, Edith knew, was a victory beyond measure. 5 years later, the Northwood cottage was no longer a hideout. It was a home. The walls were covered in paintings, vibrant, expressive canvases that pulsed with color and life. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and falling across the honey-colored wooden floors. The scent of turpentine and freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, a perfume of peace and productivity. Edith Merritt was no longer a refugee. She was one of the Berkshire's most sought-after artists. Her work, which began as a quiet form of therapy, had been discovered by a gallery owner from a nearby town. Her paintings, with their raw emotional honesty and quiet strength, resonated with people. She wasn't wealthy by Monaghan standards, but she was successful. She owned her cottage, her car, and her life. She was free. Her greatest masterpiece, however, was not on canvas. It was a little girl with a wild mane of dark hair and her mother's determined eyes, currently sitting at a small table on the porch, diligently painting a picture of a purple squirrel. "Mommy, look!" Grace called, holding up her creation. "He's a special squirrel." "He's beautiful, sweetie," Edith said, coming outside to kneel beside her. "Absolutely perfect." Grace beamed, a smile that could light up the darkest corners of the world. She was a happy, resilient child, full of laughter and a fierce love for her mother. She knew nothing of the glass tower in Manhattan, of the man whose DNA she shared, but whose name she would never carry. Her world was this cottage, these woods, and the unwavering certainty of her mother's love. Keith Witherspoon remained a constant in their lives. He visited every few months, transforming from a serious Brooklyn lawyer into Uncle Keith, the man who gave the best piggyback rides and always brought the tastiest bagels. He was their family, a bond forged not by blood, but by loyalty and kindness in a time of crisis. He'd watch Grace play, then look at Edith, a proud, happy woman so different from the shattered ghost who had walked into his office years ago, and he would just shake his head in admiration. Sometimes, late at night after Grace was asleep, Edith would sit on her porch, looking at the stars, and allow herself to think about Robert. She felt no anger anymore, only a distant, clinical pity. He had everything he thought he wanted: his empire, his name, his unfettered ambition. Tonya Todd, she'd heard through the grapevine, hadn't lasted 6 months after the scandal broke. Robert had a rotating cast of young, beautiful women, but he was alone. He had chosen a legacy of steel and glass over one of flesh and blood. He had missed it all: Grace's first steps, her first word, Mama, the simple, profound joy of holding his daughter's hand. Her own journey had been a trial by fire. The betrayal had nearly destroyed her, but like a forest after a wildfire, new life had grown from the ashes, stronger and more vibrant than before. The pain had been a crucible, melting away the frivolous, superficial parts of her life and leaving only what was real and true: her strength, her art, and her daughter. She had walked away from a millionaire's fortune, but she had found a wealth far greater. She had found herself. Looking at Grace, so full of life and untainted joy, Edith knew she wouldn't change a thing. Every tear, every moment of fear had been a step on the path that led her here, to this perfect, quiet, beautiful life. A life of her own making. A portrait of Grace. Edith's story is a powerful reminder that our greatest strength is often forged in our deepest pain. Betrayal and heartbreak can feel like the end of the world. But as she discovered, sometimes they are the violent, necessary beginning of a life that is truly our own. She walked away from wealth and power to find something far more valuable: her own voice, her own worth, and the unconditional love of her child. Her journey from a shattered wife to a resilient, thriving artist shows us that it's never too late to reclaim your life, to choose freedom over a gilded cage, and to build a future on the solid ground of self-respect. What did you think of Edith's incredible transformation? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own peace and future? Share your thoughts and similar experiences in the comments below. Your story could be the inspiration someone else needs to see today. Don't forget to like this video if it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more real-life stories of strength and redemption.